All right, folks, I have something to do in like 40 minutes, so we're gonna bang this one out pretty quickly, actually. In this particular chapter, chapter 26, we're gonna take a look at the Second World War. More specifically, I guess we'll take a look at foreign policy during FDR's administration, especially obviously highlighting World War II, but we're gonna talk a little bit about the period just before it, as obviously some context. As usual, going to be about 20 minutes or so. I'm going to set a timer on my phone. I'm sitting on the floor because Claude is taking my seat. All right. Now, let us get started. Before we do, however, these are the lesson topics right here. Not that many, all things considered. We're going to talk about the mobilization for the war. We'll talk a little bit about the military side of things, although that's not that important for our purposes. And we'll talk a little bit about some of the diplomacy that is going on both during the war and its long term consequences for after the war. One, two, three, Joe. All right, so let's take a look at the stuff going on just before World War II, because America is going to do a little bit of a change during the 1930s and the 1940s, as we are going to see. However, kind of initially, it seems like FDR's administration is continuity with the 1920s. Remember, the 1920s is a period generally of isolationism from foreign affairs. World War I was pretty traumatic. World War I, as well, kind of disillusioned a lot of Americans from overseas participation in the global political side of things, especially in the League of Nations, which we did not join. However, we are going to see that there are a lot of problems that the United States is going to have to confront one way or another as time goes on. Now, generally, FDR does continue this trend, especially in Latin America. We have the so called good neighbor policy continuing from Mr. Herbert Hoover's presidency. We do see, however, that isolationism is best expressed in the 1930s with the Neutrality Act. Remember, that's their fare. We're trying to go back to George Washington's no foreign entanglement sort of idea in the 1920s and certainly in the 1930s as well. By 1933, Hitler has taken over Germany. Mussolini is in charge of Italy, and then Japan is expanding into Manchuria and East Asia. And all of this is going on overseas, and Americans are a little bit skeptical and scared they might get sucked into those foreign affairs. So we are going to see that in response, Democrats, Republicans alike, they're going to support what is known as the Neutrality Act. Now, the Neutrality Act is going to be violated to kingdom come, as we will see later on. But essentially, it is going to be a 1930s policy of refusing to trade with belligerent nations, aka countries at war. So, any country that is currently at war, we are not going to provide arms. We are not going to provide munitions. We're not going to provide supplies. We are not even going to provide them banking loans either. And certainly, we're not transporting all that stuff to them. The main reason why there is such hostility to doing business during a wartime, thinking back to World War I for a second, the Lusitania, the Arabic, the Sussex, unrestricted submarine warfare, all of these kind of things shattered American trust that they could truly stay neutral and trade with warring countries. Now, the Neutrality Act is going to be amended slightly in 1937 with the so-called cash and carry provision, in which countries at war are allowed to buy American goods if they pay in cash, so no loans. We don't want to become entangled in the economic affairs of Europe, but also they got to carry it and transport it themselves, basically. They got to buy it here, they got to bring it back to Europe or wherever the heck. Now, the Neutrality Act is going to be passed under FDR's administration. However, FDR is going to look at the rising spread of fascism in Europe, the spread of imperial Japan in East Asia, the rise of the Italian Empire in Africa with Ethiopia, for example. And FDR is kind of thinking, you know what? I was Assistant Secretary of the Navy during Wilson's presidency during World War I, and I saw how just unprepared our country was for that war. FDR thinks that war is inevitable, but it's also necessary. FDR did believe that fascism was a horrific threat towards human civilization, and that eventually we would have to get involved to stop these horrific countries from expanding the Nazis in Germany, the fascists in Italy, and the imperialists in Japan. FDR did think it was a moral necessary to intervene, but he recognized that most Americans in the public did not want to intervene. However, kind of thinking that eventually war might come towards the United States, we do see that FDR does do some minimal preparations for war. For example, we do see that in 1940, the United States Congress is going to adopt its first ever peacetime draft, the Selective Service and Training Act in 1940, for example. We're also going to see that Americans, well, FDR kind of comes up with a brilliant strategy of how to support the Allies fighting the Nazis and also not be directly involved in the war. And kind of we do see that FDR creates a kind of program of helping out the Allies, namely the British, by kind of doing things like the Destroyers for Bases deal in 1940. Basically, we would provide some of our old World War I era destroyers, aka big old battleships, in exchange for a 99-year lease on naval bases in the Caribbean, for example. So essentially, we are just kind of recognizing that the British are fighting the Nazis on their lonesome by this point. We're going to provide them direct economic or military assistance so that they can continue the fight. Hopefully, they can beat the Nazis back on their own. Now, we're going to see that this program is sort of expanded to all countries fighting against the enemies of tyranny in the form of the Lend-Lease Act in 1941. The Lend-Lease Act essentially is going to lend not just money, but more importantly, supplies and military equipment to countries that are designated as protecting American foreign policy interests overseas. We are going to see that there is direct military supply assistance to not just the British, but to the Chinese fighting against the Japanese in the Second Sino-Japanese War. We see economic and military assistance even to the Soviet Union as well. Basically, we're lending them our military supplies, and we don't really expect it to get back to us. That's kind of the whole purpose right here. The bill that proposed it actually was bill number 1776, so a very democratic bill right there. However, America is going to eventually become directly involved in World War II itself as a consequence of the attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941. Pearl Harbor military base in Hawaii, obviously, is going to be sneak attacked by well, allegedly, by the Japanese in December of 1941. Now, kind of Japan and the United States had been butting heads in the Pacific Ocean ever since the Spanish-American War with the Philippines, but we do see that kind of the relationship between Japan and the United States is going to worsen as a result of our condemnation of their attack against China in the rape of Nanking and the invasion of Nanking in the beginnings of in the 1930s, and especially intensified in the late 1930s. Our relation with Japan is not that great. We decide to cut off all oil shipments to them, do some economic embargoes of oil going to the Japanese. And the Japanese kind of responded to that in recognizing, wow, the Americans are our number one competitor in the Pacific Ocean. Let's just get them out of the way so we can focus on attacking East Asia a bit more. Now, regardless of their intent, regardless of what you think the United States did in kind of maybe even provoking the Japanese into attacking us first, like a sort of Texas polk situation, we do see that America is nonetheless drawn into the war. Personally, I think that we were attacked and we justly attacked the Japanese in return, at least in 1941. Germany eventually declares war on us in recognition that they had an alliance with the Japanese. Anyway, we're at war. We're on the side of the Allies, the Soviets, the Americans, the British. We're all one big happy family. Put an asterisk in that because we're going to debunk that in a second. Anyway, let's talk about the mobilization at home. World War II is like World War I in many regards, but it's also severely different. It's especially different in the sense that compared to World War I, we were more prepared. It wasn't a lot of preparation. FDR did scramble to prepare and organize an effective mobilization towards fighting against the Axis powers in World War II, but it eventually got we got our stuff together, more or less. For example, we are going to see various new departments, new wartime organizations from the government start popping up. We've got the Office of War Mobilization, which did a lot of things, especially in the realm of resource management, nationalizing railroads, for example, kind of coordinating the movement of goods from place to place within the United States. We see rationing as well actually take place, not just for food, but for things like oil, things like tires, things like a bunch of different stuff. He fought the Battle of Bedford Falls. I'm trying to do a It's a Wonderful Life bit right here, but none of you are going to get that reference. Anyway, another thing that the United States, though, is going to do, just like in World War I, is propaganda. Propaganda to get Americans on board with this war. And for the most part, Americans are on board with World War II. I mean, the enemy is clearly evil. The Nazis in Germany, the fascists, well, the fascists in Italy were a joke of human beings, but never mind. They did horrible things in Ethiopia. The Japanese doing horrific war crimes in East Asia. We are going to see that there's effective propaganda to ensure on board mobilization with the war. Definitely, it was a more popular, viewed as a more just war compared to World War I, but nonetheless, propaganda did occur, especially aimed at, well, we'll talk about women more in a second. We're going to see that labor unions are going to be kind of put on board with this war through the National War Labor Board. Basically, this is going to be very similar to World War I in the sense of here's a bunch of wartime benefits, here's some worker protections. Please don't go on strike. If you go on strike, I'm sending you straight up to I almost said concentration camp. That's not true. I'm sending you to a prison. I'm sending you to jail. But we do see kind of that there is this effective mobilization of workers in kind of making sure that wartime production is at the highest it can be. Now, kind of at home, we do see that the concern with war is going to be always inflation. When the government pumps a lot of money into the economy, that tends to lead to the problem of inflation. If people are getting paid more, that means that people who are selling stuff, they want to raise their prices more. Now, in order to combat this problem of inflation, that's where the Office of Price Administration comes into play. Basically, there's going to be freezes on things like rent, freezes on price increase. There is going to be a lot of regulation of the economy during World War II. It is a more kind of holistic total war compared to what we went through in World War I. World War I was a cakewalk in comparison to World War II. And even then, Americans didn't suffer all that much, at least in terms of direct fighting, but more on that later. Anyway, World War II is also going to be a turning point in regards to the home front with regard, I said that multiple times, whatever, with regard to things like gender and race. Now, just like with World War I, there's going to be a mass movement of African Americans from the South into the North. Largely, where are the jobs? They're in northern factories. Who's going to be in them? Well, we could, get white men, but no, we need them to fight over in Europe. Let's hire African Americans. So, African American labor is a crucial part of World War II. And in order to ensure kind of that African Americans are on board with the war and don't strike and don't do things like demand civil rights or anything like that, FDR is going to be proactive in kind of recognizing kind of the need to end segregation on a federal level. We do see that there's the Office of Employment Equality. I kind of messed that up, that acronym right there. But more importantly, we do see the rise of African American organizations like CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality. This kind of group of African American activists, they're largely going to work with FDR in ensuring that there isn't this kind of wartime discrimination. They're going to say, the African Americans are going to say, guys like William Randolph or William Rand. I forget his name. I'm going to look it up in a second. But we do see that kind of there is this cooperation between African Americans and the national government. Remember, African Americans are a crucial part of the New Deal coalition. More importantly, they're a crucial part to the wartime effort as well. Now, we also see that World War II is going to employ, I should say, more than just African American labor, but also Hispanic labor as well. We are going to see that in order to make sure there is enough food production, because we're sending all of our boys overseas, we're going to hire immigrant laborers. And we see that especially in the realm of the Bracero program. Basically, the Bracero program is going to be a program in which the United States is going to kind of relax immigration restrictions for people from Central America specifically. We're going to hire very cheap Hispanic workers, namely Mexican workers, to work in our fields. We do see that this is going to lead to the effect of increased Hispanic immigration to the United States, a trend that we will talk about more in Unit 10, of course. Now, Bracero program is not going to be the greatest time for Hispanic Americans. They do face civil injustices. There's a lot of racial inequality, but we do see that nonetheless, we are expanding who counts as a part of the war effort. It's not just going to be our white boys, it's going to be our Hispanic boys as well. Hispanic Americans also served in the war as well. I can think of my friend's grandparents actually as an example of that. Anyway, Native Americans are also involved in the war. We do see that during the war, there are some gains for Native Americans, namely through their kind of service in things like the Navajo Code Talkers, for example. Native Americans are definitely going to be employed by the United States military as a kind of special not co-ops, special operatives because of their language skills, but also because of their loyalty and bravery to the United States, actually. However, even though there are some positive gains in the realm of civil rights, beginnings of African American civil rights in the form of the Congress of Racial Equality, for example, with these organizations like that, we do see that the war is going to lead to a lot of prejudice against our wartime enemies. Not so much the Germans, but namely the Japanese. Anti-Japanese sentiment in the United States has been kind of going on for quite some time, but we're going to see that it's intensified because of the horrors of the Japanese in East Asia, but also because of the attack on Pearl Harbor. Japanese Americans are going to be rounded up actually during World War II as a result of Executive Order 9066. This is going to be basically FDR saying, for the interest of national security, we are going to lock up all Japanese Americans on the West Coast. We believe that they are potential spies for the Japanese Empire. We're going to be proactive and round them up into internment camps. Now, obviously, this is a very unjust sort of action right here. And it is going to be a big stain on the United States government, especially FDR's administration. And that is going to be, however, unfortunately, just a consequence of kind of World War II prejudice right here. The one last group I didn't actually put down a slide for or a PowerPoint for or a bullet point for is women. Women are going to be employed en masse in World War II, as I'm sure you already know from our discussion of A. Philip Randolph. That's the person who it was. Anyway, World War II women, Rosie the Riveter, probably the most famous example of this wartime propaganda. Here we have wartime mobilization of women in the factories, but also some women serving in armed forces, or at least in auxiliary units in the armed forces. Now, let's talk about the war itself, the fighting, the shooting, the guns, the battles, etc. Now, you don't need to know specifics about any specific battle. I will name drop a couple in a second. World War I is a lot different from World War II. World War II is a lot more of a mobilized war, tanks, planes, armored cars, and tanks and guns came to take away our sons, but every man will stand behind the men behind the wire. That's an IRA song, actually, not relevant to World War II. Anyway, mobilized war. We're not doing trenches. Fast, fast, boom, boom, shoot, shoot, etc. Now, the Allies in World War II, obviously the UK, the US, and the Soviet Union being the big three, so to say. Now, the war in Europe looks a little bit different from the war in East Asia. Initially, Americans are not directly on the European mainland, not on continental Europe, until much later. And this is actually going to be a site of controversy between the Allies themselves. World War II is especially horrific for the Russians. For the Soviet Union, the Nazis they committed genocide in East Asia, and they directed largely their military to conduct horrific atrocities against the Soviet Union. Joseph Stalin's going to call on Churchill and FDR to open up a second front. Now, we're going to see that for a variety of reasons, namely logistics, namely logistics. The Americans and the British are a little hesitant to open up that second front, and they're not going to until kind of later, as we will see. Now, initially, the way that the Western involvement is going to go in this war is first the invasion of North Africa, pushing through German and Italian occupied areas in North Africa, and then sticking up through the soft underbelly of Europe in invading Italy. However, the big thing that's going to kind of turn this war in Europe, at least in terms of alleviating some of Russia's concerns in World War II, is going to be the Normandy invasions of 1944. On June 6, 1944, we've got D-Day, Deployment Day, in northern France. This is going to be the biggest amphibious invasion in American history, in world history, actually, come to think of it. We are going to see that it effectively is going to start that process where the Germans are being pushed back into Germany. The Soviets, they're going to be able to start pushing them towards the east. Eventually, the Soviet Union reaches Berlin by May of 1945. The war is basically over after that. May of 1945. The war is basically over after that. Now, the war in East Asia, though, is a little bit different. Unfortunately, we're not going to have that much time to talk about it, but it's pretty brutal, pretty devastating for everybody involved. The Japanese were a very formidable foe, so to say, in East Asia, especially their very die-hard nationalism. Now, the way that the kind of strategy worked in World War II in the Pacific theater was a lot of naval battles, a lot of aircraft battles, a lot of amphibious invasions, the so-called strategy of island hopping. Boom, boom, boom. We're going from this island to this island to this island, inching our way closer and closer to the Japanese mainland. But these battles that are going on these islands, even if they're very small, rather insignificant points right there, they are very bloody battles on both sides. The Japanese and the Americans and the British, they are going to suffer quite a bit in these conflicts right here. In order to soften up Japan for an invasion, we see aerial bombardments. We do see the dropping of bombs into Japanese cities. We see this in Germany too, just to kind of bring that up a little bit. But it's pretty bad in East Asia. Now, kind of in order to prepare for a potential invasion or to prevent a potential invasion of the Japanese mainland, looking at the horrific casualties of the war so far, this is where the Manhattan Project is going to come into play. Basically, during the war, the United States was terrified that the Nazis were developing atomic weapons. So, in response, we develop our own atomic weapons. This is the so called Manhattan Project, led by famous guys like J. Robert Oppenheimer, for example. We are going to see that the Manhattan Project eventually is going to be used, though, in kind of bombing the Japanese specifically. Now, there's a lot of controversy about the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. We're not going to get into that, but needless to say, this is going to end the war. We are going to see that eventually Japan is going to surrender by August of 1945. The war is over. Just a couple of general names, because general names always come up. Douglas MacArthur, major leader in the Pacific Ocean, who was in the bonus army, if you remember, and Dwight Eisenhower in coordinating D-Day. He's going to pop up again, both of these guys, actually. Now, last thing that we're going to talk about is wartime diplomacy, because during the war, there's a lot of coordination and strategy that's going on between the Allied powers. This is kind of different from World War I, actually. In World War I, yeah, we're against the Germans. But in World War II, there is a lot more actual military coordination between the forces of the Soviets, the Americans, and of course, the British as well. During the war itself, the Allied leaders, the big three especially, are going to meet several times. The Casablanca Conference, Joseph Stalin is not there for that, but Churchill, the American President FDR, and the Chinese nationalist President Chiang Kai-shek, they're going to agree on some general terms. For example, agreeing to invade North Africa, eventually invade Italy. They're also going to agree that they are going to coordinate some strategy in East Asia as well. But the more important conferences, the ones between Stalin, FDR, and Churchill, especially Tehran Conference, in which we are going to plan out the D-Day invasion. But the more important ones, because they set up a lot of the developments post-World War II, are the Yalta and Potsdam Conference. Now, the Potsdam Conference basically just reaffirms everything that was said at the Yalta Conference. So we're going to take a look mostly at the Yalta Conference. In the Yalta Conference, the Allies have a lot of different. They basically recognize the war is almost over. We're going to win this thing. We need to coordinate what the peace looks like. Now, kind of some things the Soviets, the Americans, and the British do agree on. One thing they agree on is the division of Germany into 4 sectors. Basically, one Allied power is going to be in charge of coordinating the reconstruction, the transition to peace in these 4 sectors of Germany. We are going to lead a process of denazification, in theory anyway, replacing the Nazi government with a civilian democratic one. However, where there is controversy, they agree on the United Nations as well. Everybody in the United States kind of recognizes, whoa, this war could have been prevented if we had the League of Nations. So most people in the United States are going to be okay with the United Nations. Now, where there is controversy, though, is going to be this question of self-determination for Eastern European states. Now, the Soviets, they want a buffer between themselves and the rest of the world, namely Germany, namely Western Europe. Russia's been through a couple of wars at this point, the Russian Civil War, the First World War, the Second World War, all of these horrific wars involving outside invaders. Now, in order to prevent that, in Stalin's opinion, we need to make sure that there are pro-communist governments in Eastern Europe. We're not going to give them free elections. We're going to give them one election to choose a communist, basically, to govern their country. Now, Churchill is the most adamant that this is not what we should do. Basically, kind of Churchill is going to say, we want free elections in Poland. Now, that question of free elections in Eastern Europe, namely in the biggest, most important of them, Poland, and I say that mostly because I'm biased because of my last name, but kind of we do see that there is a big controversy over that country in particular. Now, FDR is kind of the moderate and sort of the moderating voice in the kind of crowd, and he's actually going to say to Churchill, yeah, Churchill, we need to give in to Stalin's demands. Why? We need them to help win this war, and we should have a post-war cooperation between all of the parties involved in this war. We recognize we led the world during this war. We should lead the world after peace, and in order to do that, we need cooperation from the Soviet Union. This is one concession we're going to give them. FDR is going to be called a commie for doing this. FDR is going to be, well, I mean, you could blame him for allowing for communism to spread into Eastern Europe, but nonetheless, FDR had his kind of wartime reasons, you could say. And kind of the reason why this is relevant is communism is going to spread after World War II. It is going to spread to new places outside the Soviet Union. Joseph Stalin kind of says, I promise free elections. Ultimately, no, it's the communists that come into power there. Now, that question of Eastern Europe's independence, that's going to be a major controversy that will lead us to the Cold War. Now, the Potsdam Conference, FDR is dead by this point. We're going to see that he is replaced by Harry Truman. FDR won two more elections, by the way. They're not relevant or important for our purposes, but Truman, he's going to be the guy in charge of the United States now. He is going to kind of actually lead a bit more of an aggressive confrontational relationship with Joseph Stalin. This is going to lead the seeds for the Cold War to begin later on. All right. Well, I think that is everything actually in World War II. Thank you guys. Have a blessed day. And exit the full screen and stop recording. And stop recording.